So again, for this case here, we're going to be doing a 3-unit implant case this time. But what's different here is that we're not going to be using like scan bodies in this case. We're going to be doing it so that we're going to be designing this implant case on top of custom abutments or scanned in tie bases. So for those of you that are just coming in, it should look like this. Again, if your specific case doesn't look exactly like mine, don't worry. We're going to go through the case setup as well. All right. Again, the name of the case should be Screw Retained Implant Bridge / Manual Implant Positioning. Again, a quick review of the specific case. So let's say you get the case back and you don't have scan bodies for it, but it's still implant case. You still want to create screw channels through your restorations. We're going to be treating these implants as like a prep essentially, right? So if your case doesn't look exactly like mine, it'll probably say for implant positions 3 and 5, they're going to be listed as copings, right? That gives us the option to like reduce them or do like a facial cutback. But in this case here, we just do a full contour restoration. So we're going to change that. And I'm going to walk everyone through how to change that to make sure we're all on the same page. So let's go ahead, everyone. Let's click number 3 on the prescription. And we're going to make sure that the restoration type, instead of coping, we're going to select anatomic crown, right? Once you click that, the options and parameters are going to change, but we're going to make sure that everyone has the same parameters selected. So again, material here doesn't matter so much for this demonstration, but the first thing I want everyone to check is under implant base, we want to make sure we have screw retained checked off here. Right, so we're going to select screw retained. Under additional scans, we're going to make sure that we have don't use scan body selected. So on the far right hand option here, we're going to choose don't use scan body. The description for that, again, is you're going to be scanning in the tie base and then you're going to be manually positioning your screw channel on your restoration. So the difference between this case setup and the last one is that the scan body that you scanned in, that determines the position of your screw channel. In this one, you can actually manually position it yourself. I don't believe the gentleman is here anymore, but in this case here, you do have the option to scale your screw channels instead of having them be locked in. So we're going to make sure we have don't use scan body here. At that point, I don't believe we have an extra gingiva scan for this specific case. I have that checked off on mine, but that's fine.
We are doing an anatomic crown, not a coping.
We're going to make sure that we have anatomic crown selected. Yeah, what that does is it just skips over the reduction step because we're not going to really need to do that for this workshop. Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to do don't use scan body here. Again, we're going to leave all the other parameters at default. And then we're going to, let's go ahead and just have make sure you have extra gingiva scan checked off as well, right? So for number 3, it's going to be anatomic crown. Material doesn't matter for this case. We're going to do screw retained. Make sure it says manual positioning. When you change it to don't use scan body, that's when it says manual positioning here, right? We do have an extra gingiva scan, and we're not going to do the virtual gingiva. We're not going to do the thimble crown. We're going to pull the margin of our crowns to our implant site. Let's make sure we do have extra gingiva scan checked off. We want to make sure that that little check mark is there. And from here, we'll click OK. No, that's fine. And that's all parameters that you're going to adjust later on when you're actually doing these cases. And we're going to be able to actually adjust those in the design as well if you need to. Things like cement gap, actually, that does matter in this case, because since we don't have a specific like scan body library, then you can actually determine the cement gap between your restoration and your tie base or abutment at this step. And that's something we can go into further detail later on, but typically for a 3-unit bridge, anywhere from 0.06 to 0.08 cement gap is where we want to be. The more units in the bridge, kind of the bigger that cement gap should be just for fit purposes. But for 1 to 3 unit cases, 0.04 to 0.06 works fine. And minimal thickness, depending on material that you're milling in, that changes slightly, but not much. We're just going to click OK after number 3. And then we're going to set up number 5 the same way, but instead of clicking number 5 and going through all of that again, just hold Control on your keyboard and then just click number 5. What that does, it just copies over the last prescription that you set up, and it just copies it to any click on the prescription page for you. One other thing that we're going to make sure that we change is your pontic, because this is going to be our bridge. So instead of a reduced pontic, we're going to change this to anatomic pontic. So everyone go ahead and click number 4 for me. So under pontics here, I believe some of you might have it defaulted to reduced pontic. Again, the coping and reduced pontic steps in the design allows you to do like a universal shrink or like a facial cutback. For this case, we're not going to be doing that. We're doing a full contour restoration. So instead of reduced pontic, just choose anatomic pontic here. From anatomic pontic, you don't need to change the material. What's important to note when setting up your pontic restorations is that you want to make sure that the options and parameters are consistent with the other restorations on your prescription page, right? So if your implant sites have an extra gingiva scan, you want to make sure that you have the extra gingiva scan checked off here for your pontics as well. So we're going to make sure we have extra gingiva scan selected. Again, we're in anatomic pontic, not reduced pontic. Material, extra gingiva scan. We're not doing a virtual gingiva. We're not doing the thimble crown workflow, and we're not doing the virtual extraction. The virtual gingiva is something more for like the full arches, which we'll get into after lunch. Does anyone have any questions so far? We're just going to click OK. And you're going to notice that you have 2 control points for your connectors here. Since this is going to be our bridge case, we want to make sure that those control points are green. If you were doing, say, like a splint case, so let's say number 3 and number 4 splinted together, but you wanted number 5 to be completely separate, you can turn off this connector here and just have 4 and 3 splinted together, and then number 5 as a separate crown. In this case, we're going to create one single, one bridge. So we want to make sure we have our residual dentition marked. So I always like to mark our 2 immediate adjacent teeth, so number 2 and number 6. Again, residual dentition is down at the bottom of the screen. We're not doing a virtual extraction here. And again, you can just copy that with Control over to number 6. You don't have to mark the entire quadrant or the entire arch, as long as you mark the immediate adjacent teeth. Again, your antagonist, you really only have to mark one antagonist tooth. Sometimes the software just automatically marks all of the opposing for you, and that's fine. Again, antagonist is under residual dentition at the bottom. Okay, so just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, I know we set up number 3 initially, but if we click number 5, you can see that it copied that prescription over, and I just want to make sure that we have the implant position set up properly, right? So again, for tooth number 5, we're in anatomic crown. Material is going to be consistent with the other positions on the bridge. We're in screw retained, but this time we're going to do a manual positioning implant restoration. We do have an extra gingiva scan. We want to make sure we have that checked off. We have don't use scan body as our option here. And then we're not designing a virtual gingiva. We're not doing a thimble crown, and we will be pulling our crowns to our implant sites. Does anyone have any questions about this setup?
What happens if you don't allocate the adjacent teeth?
So if you don't allocate the adjacent teeth, the software is going to assume that you're designing your restorations on like just single die. So it's not going to ask you for like that specific jaw scan. It's just going to ask you for the working prep teeth or the implant positions. And when you turn on show distances, in the previous design case, it shows us like how heavy we are in approximately. It'll show you that you're making contact with your adjacent teeth, but it's not going to show you how heavy you are if you don't mark your adjacent teeth here. All right, so from there, we're going to click Save. And then from Save, we're going to click Design on the right-hand side. Again, since I've already designed this case, it's asking us, do I want to pick up from where I last left off, or do I want to start over completely? I want everyone to just choose load scan data only because we're just going to start over from scratch. Okay, I'm going to bring back all of our scans here. Your screen, you don't necessarily need to do this. I just want to kind of walk through how we're going to go through this together. Typically for all implant level cases, if you're doing it from like a desktop scanner, you will always have the option to remove that gingival mask, right? If you're doing a manual positioning case or if you're doing something with the scan body, it's really important that when you scan that scan body in, that you remove that gingival mask because you want to make sure that the scan body is completely seated on top of that analog, right? Sometimes with the gingival mask there, you're unable to verify whether or not the scan body is seated properly. In this case, we do have a separate gingiva just because these tie bases are pretty far subgingival. So it's important that we're able to kind of separate that in our design. You can see here that instead of scanning in a scan body, they just screwed in those tie bases, and we're just treating those tie bases as a prep, right? So in the first case here, it's asking us to detect our margin line selection for tooth number 3. So I'm going to hide my jaw scan and my gingiva scan here. And your screen might not look exactly like this. It might just look like this, right? With just number 3 showing. What we're going to do is we're going to mark the margin line where we want our restoration to completely sit. We want our restoration to completely sit all the way around our titanium base. So in margin line detection, it works the same way as the emergence profile, except this time it's just one click. So I'm going to click the edge of the tie base here. And you're going to see when you're in margin line detection, that purple window that's following my cursor. So when we're working here, this outline is just showing us our specific cursor, what surface we're on. So if I want to make sure that I have my margin line right on the edge of where our contour is, we're going to move this slightly down, and it just shows the surface of which our cursor is on. Is everyone kind of following along with that? So I can see here that I'm a little bit high on my margin just based on that little purple window. So I'm going to move that down slightly, and I'm just right on that edge. I'm going to click it once, and it's marked just like that. Doesn't have to be perfect when you do a manual positioning case here, because a lot of times the cement will fill in any gaps that you leave in your design. But if I want to adjust this at all, I can go over to correct draw, and I can adjust my margin where I need to. All right. If you accidentally pull it too far, you can always do Control Z to undo, or you can just click the undo button. Right? For this case, this looks pretty good. Again, I'm going to move pretty fast because I want to make sure we stay on time. But if anyone gets a little lost or has any questions, please just let me know. After we marked our margin line here, you can see that it forms an area above the margin line. This is what it's going to refer to as the preparation, right? So in this case here, it's obviously not a prep tooth. This is going to be our tie base, but this whole area is labeled as our preparation. So preparation number 3. This gray area here is the complete surface on which we can move our screw channel. So the manual positioning is the ability for us to adjust the position of the screw channel anywhere we see fit inside our preparation. In the previous case where we used a scan body, the scan body dictated where the screw channel began, right? In this case here, we can actually control that completely. This can get a little finicky, and some people get a little lost in trying to position their screw channel directly parallel on top of their restoration. So what I like to do is I'm focusing on my actual tie base itself. So I'm going to hide my screw channel using the show hide menu here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my mouse, and I'm going to angle my restoration so that I'm staring straight down my preparation or my tie base, right? Again, using the 2 buttons on my mouse to pan my screen and the right click to adjust the angle of which I'm looking at. Once you have your view to directly parallel to the opening of your tie base, you can actually, let's turn our screw channel back on, and we can see that we're a little bit tilted, right? Our screw channel is a little bit tilted. In the wizard menu, you can select set to view direction. If you click set to view direction, it automatically adjusts your screw channel to your current view. Right, so now I know that my screw channel is directly parallel with my tie base. At that point, we can see that it's a little bit off center. So now that we know that we have it parallel, we can actually click the body of the screw channel and we can drag it along the preparation and we can just center it there. And we're just going to check that in different views just to make sure it's centered. Again, a little finicky, doesn't have to be perfect, just as long as it covers the tie base. And in this step here, this is where we can actually control the diameter of our screw channel as well. It defaults to 2.3. I think that works universally for the majority of implant systems, but you can make that smaller or bigger if you need to. Right? Everyone sees that here in diameter. Great. So this looks pretty good. You can also click and drag using the control sphere at the top. But typically, I like to just use my view and just set it to my current view. So, and this is again for number 3. We're just going to click next and do the same steps for number 5. I know typically for like the majority of your full mouth restorations, you're going to be using tie bases. Not tie bases and scan bodies, and the previous workflow that we did in the last case. But this workflow actually kind of covers like if you were doing like a temporary conversion and you were to use like temporary cylinders, right? This is how you would do like a all-on-4 using temporary cylinders, is this workflow. So again, we're going to make sure, a lot of times this happens where you get the positions of the teeth mixed up. So we want to make sure we're on tooth number 5. And we're going to do the same steps. So we're going to mark our margin line. Margin line, again, is just a single click, right? If I need to correct that, I can, but this looks pretty good. I'm just going to click next after I've determined my margin line. After the software has formed the preparation, I'm going to then make sure that my screw channel is where I want it. Usually the algorithm does a pretty good job of picking your screw channel for you based on your margin line and preparation and the scan data orientation. But if I wanted to fine tune it, again, I would just focus not on the screw channel itself for now, but I would focus on the actual tie base. I would use my right button click, rotate, make sure that I'm parallel with the opening here. What I'm looking at is kind of just the shadows that the tie base is creating all the way around. That's kind of how I know I'm parallel, right? From there, once I have the direction, I'm going to click set to view direction. That changes the angulation of the screw channel. And we can see here that we're a little bit off center. So we can actually click the screw channel and just drag it to the center here. We kind of verify it on different axes, but I wouldn't get too caught up with getting it dead center, right? As long as we have the majority of the tie base covered, we'll be good to go. If I wanted to adjust my diameter here, I would. So I can change that to 2.3 to 2.5, etc. And again, that's going to be your diameter, not your radius. Once I have my screw channel set on both of my implant positions, I'm going to click next. All right. Everyone with me so far? We're in the cement gap step here. Okay. The cement gaps is pretty straightforward. We can see here that it's separated into 2 sections, right? And those of you who have done crown and bridge in the past, this step is exactly the same. We can have our default cement gap set to 0.08. Typically for bridges, anywhere from 0.06 to 0.08 is fine. Single units, if you were doing this workflow, 0.04 to 0.06 typically. The yellow area here on both, and whenever you make any changes to your cement gap, it's going to be for all your implant sites or all your preparations across your specific case. You're not doing it individually. The green area, the collar here, is a 1 millimeter distance from your margin, and that's where your restoration is going to sit directly flush to your preparation or to your tie base. We can see that we really just want this flush seating area to be around the shelf of that tie base, right? We don't want it to creep along the body of it because then we're going to be running into fit issues. So what I'm going to do is the only thing I'm going to change is Under the select zones by distance, the from margin, the green area here, I'm going to click the down arrow or the back arrow, and I'm going to reduce this little lip so that it's only sitting on that shelf and not creeping up to the side of the tie base. Yes.
More so towards fixed. I guess my question is, I heard you mention that the gap is pertaining to both of the units, not just one specifically. Can you designate one differently than the other?
So right now in this specific menu, on this cement gap menu, it adjusts all of them.
Okay.
But if you wanted like a more unique fit per individual implant site, you can actually go to add another zone, which is right underneath the cement gap setting here. And what this allows us to do, and then you can set how big of a distance you want that zone to be. And this allows you to paint individual implant sites to change the cement gap for that specific one.
And it's similar to fixed work. Let's say I had a very shallow prep that I wanted to be tighter than...
Exactly.
Same thing. All right.
Yeah, so yeah, if you were doing like, if this was actually natural dentition, this window and workflow is the exact same. Great question. But we're not going to do that here. So that's going to be your cement gaps. Again, all I did was adjust the no cement gap area to 0.08. And let's actually adjust this to 0.75 or 0.7. And we can see here now that flush area is just seating around the shelf. Before moving forward, I actually go over to border, and we can see here that this, and when doing crown and bridges, this step is actually very important too, not just for this implant workflow. We can see here that from our margin lines around our tie base, this is going to give us like an extra border around our restoration, right? This is creating an extra lip all the way around our margin line, kind of protecting that margin area. If we want our design just to completely go to the margin area without creating this like protective border that we're unable to freeform later on, we would actually zero out the horizontal and the angled parameters here so that we get rid of that protective border, because there's plenty of material for the restoration to sit on here. Typically for implant manual positioning restorations, you're going to have your restorations sitting on tie bases, so you don't need that extra protective area around the tie bases. Really, when you're doing it in for natural dentition and the prep shoulder shelf is less than ideal, then you want to create a little bit of protection around that for like zirconia. But in this case, there's plenty of material there. Does anyone have any questions about that? We don't need that extra protective border around our margin. So from there, I'm going to click next. Okay. This option actually gives us the ability to do the emergence profiles. But in this case, we're actually going to just design the full crown directly to our implant site this time. So we can actually skip over the emergence profile steps. Usually for single units, I like to keep it on. For bridges, especially like full mouth restorations, we skip the emergence profile step almost every single time. So I'm skipping it for number 3, and then I'm skipping it again for number 5.
Why? Why skip it?
So in the previous design, it's separated into 2, right? The emergence profile, and then your abutment bottoms, and then you had your full anatomy on top. This way, when you skip it, we're actually just going to place that tooth library, and instead of separating at the emergence profile, you can actually fully just freeform it all the way to the implant site. It depends which one you prefer more. Like if you like having the abutment bottoms and that smooth gingival interaction all the way around without having to freeform each thing individually, then I would say keep abutment bottoms on, create your emergence profile. But if you want just a kind of like completely seamless design and the ability to freeform top to bottom all the way to the implant site, then you skip it. It's just 2 different workflows, but you can definitely do both. So in this step here, again, it's asking us if we want to copy or mirror the teeth. So if I wanted to copy this premolar or this canine, I think that's premolar, over to my design, I could. If I wanted to copy this molar into my design, I could. But in this case here, I'm actually going to skip the copy mirror teeth again. So In the last case, we were just working with one single unit. And so the placement of that was pretty straightforward. Left click, click drag, shift to scale, etc. When I'm working in a bridge, I actually like to work in the chain mode. So instead of clicking and dragging each individual tooth into place, I'm going to go into the chain mode here. And if I hide my jaw scan, what you're going to see is that the teeth are now connected, right? What's nice about this is that the teeth will always stay in contact with each other. Like if you scale one tooth, the tooth right next to it will shrink a little bit so that you're not creating any like interferences or any overlap in your design. And that just makes things a whole lot easier when you're actually placing the teeth, etc. Right? A quick breakdown of the chain mode. You have your individual teeth. Each individual tooth has a control point. So once you have that tooth in a specific position, you can actually lock it in, and no matter what adjustments you make in other parts of the chain, that specific point will not move. All the teeth are connected along the tube, and then at the end of the tube there, you have your control discs, right? And each control disc has a locking sphere as well. So the first thing I do when working in the chain mode is I'm going to hide my antagonist here. And I'm going to adjust my occlusal height, right? So I have my chain, no points are locked, so everything moves as an entire unit. So I'm going to adjust the occlusal height here. Oh, one more thing. We have show distances turned on, but we want to make sure, you can see here that it's defaulted to show intersections. Again, what that means is it's only going to show me a heat map of any intersecting data, right? And oftentimes that's less than ideal. So what I like to do is, again, I like to go down to show intersections and change it to show contacts instead. So if I do show contacts, now if I move my teeth, not only does it show me any intersecting data, but it actually shows me proximity as well. So any areas in that dark blue means that I'm 0.2 millimeters away from my antagonist, right? And perfect occlusion there is at 0, which is that teal color. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to adjust my occlusal height with nothing locked in. So I'm a little heavy on my molar here, but that's fine. I kind of like where my first premolar is, so I'm going to leave that there. And then I'm going to adjust the position in the occlusal view. So here we're just going to, nothing is again locked in. I'm going to hide my antagonist. I'm going to adjust the position just like that. So I adjusted the occlusal height, and then I adjusted the bridge buccal lingual into position. From there, what I'm going to do is if I highlight one of these control points, you're going to see that the opposite control disc is also highlighted. That allows me to kind of pivot my chain along the opposite end. So if I go over here to my mesial control disc, and let's say I want to bump this side out a little bit more towards the buccal, you can see here that it's allowing me to pivot around that distal disc there, right? And if you click and drag this disc mesial distal as well, you can see that the teeth scale in unison together, right? So right here, I'm going to adjust the position, Shift S to make my stone model a little bit transparent. We're also going to turn on adjacent teeth so that I can see how heavy my contacts are. And we can see here we're a little bit heavy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my control disc. I'm going to move that more towards the distal so that I have a more ideal contact here. Right? Now I can see that I'm a little heavy in my premolar, but that's fine. I kind of like the position of this already. And let's say my molar is a little bit heavy and high still. Again, I haven't locked anything into position yet, but I'm going to go to the distal control disc now and move this down towards the gingiva. It allows me to pivot slightly. And we're going to move this molar into a little bit more ideal position here. We're still a little heavy, and that's totally fine. And then I can see that I'm extremely heavy with my distal contact of my molar. So I'm going to move this control disc towards the mesial direction, and that's reducing and just kind of scaling that molar down a little bit, right? I can still see I'm a little heavy. I'm going to keep going. Doesn't have to be perfect here. We're just going to get close, right? We're still a little heavy. We can make these fine-tune adjustments later on in freeforming. Again, we're a little heavy here. I'm going to adjust this slightly. Oops. So if you don't lock anything in, it just moves everything together. Once you like the positions of the control discs, I like to lock them in. So now that my control discs are in a position that I want, no matter where I click and drag my chain, the ends of the discs stay in position, or the ends of the chain stay in position, and I can fine tune the positions of the individual teeth. So after we locked in the ends, we go towards the middle of the chain. The middle of the chain here is our second premolar, right? So I'm going to turn on our opposing. If I wanted to create a little bit more of a occlusion here with my second premolar, I can move this up slightly, right? And I like that. I'm a little heavy, and don't worry, we can adjust that in a little bit. So I'm going to, and if I wanted to create a sort of tilt and rotate, I can hold control on my keyboard and I can rotate as well. Once I have my premolar in a position where I want, I'm going to lock that. So again, the workflow so far in the chain mode, and this is going to carry over to like full arch work as well, right? Imagine instead of doing 3 units, we were doing all 15 units. The workflow would be the same. We would lock in the end discs first, go to the middle of the chain. In this case, it's the second premolar. If we were working with our full arch, it would be numbers 8 and 9 would be the centers of that chain. Once we have the center of the chain locked in, then we can fine tune the other positions. So I'm a little high here. I can click and drag my tooth and move this towards the gingiva, fine tune my occlusion. I like the scaling of everything so far. I'm not going to adjust that too much. And we can see here that we're still a little heavy, but I kind of like where my occlusion is. And just by looking at our case here, we're about probably like 80% done with the overall design, right? And this is one feature that we didn't get to highlight in the last case. If we go over to advanced, I mean, we touched on it, but we weren't able to really demonstrate it. So once I have my chain in a position where I want, we're actually going to adjust our anatomy of our occlusal table here. So under the advanced tab, again, we're still in tooth placement. We're going to go over to the same one we used before. So we're going to go over to instant anatomic morphing, which is the third option there, right here, right? With instant anatomic morphing on, we're going to do the instant anatomic morphing against the antagonist. You do have an option where you can just do an instant cut, where it just cuts and creates a flat surface anywhere that it's intersecting with your antagonist anatomy. But I like to actually adjust our tooth library to our opposing. So if I use this middle option here, we can see that, let's say this molar is a little heavy, right? Intersecting with our antagonist. If I just click that molar slightly, it automatically adjusts that opposing to my antagonist scan. And no matter where I click it, I'm only going to ever so slightly create that contact. It's not allowing me to intersect with that data.
What's the exact distance that it does to 0?
It does it to about negative 0.1. So it's like intersecting just a little bit. Let's say like you're just touching and you're compressing a little bit. That's where it's going to. I haven't found that exact parameter for the instant anatomic morphing, but I can look into that for sure. But we know that 0 is this teal color here. And you can see that it just instantly adapts it to about a negative 0.1 intersection. We can pull it out slightly as well. But I'm going to create a little bit broader of a point, and then we can adapt that later on. And we're just going to do the same thing with our other teeth as well. So we can see here we're a little heavy. I'm just going to click and drag, and maybe I reposition this cusp tip a little bit. And this blue color here is kind of what I want. Let's say I'm going to create a little bit broader, heavier of a contact, so I can adapt that in the next step. And then I'm going to do the last one with our first premolar here. Just click and drag slightly. And that looks pretty good. So if I hide my antagonist here, we have our chain positions. We're actually a little heavy, so I'm going to just click and drag this slightly out. All right. So again, we're in tooth placement, but we should be about 90% of the way done with our design, right? We really want to focus on the overall size, shape, rotation, and we want to get our occlusion pretty close in the tooth placement step. Those things there if you wait until the free-forming step with the brushes and the anatomy tool, you're going to be spending a lot of time with your design. We want the software to do the majority of the work, right? We really just want to do the fine-tuning steps in the next step, in the free-forming. So, and things like marginal ridges and stuff like that, we can actually make that adjustment in the next step. But again, I just want to be pretty happy in this step here, pretty content with my overall design. Just one last check. And that looks fine. So we're going to keep moving along. Does anyone have any questions with the chain mode, the advanced tab, etc.? No? Oh.
So the chain and everything, that makes sense. My question to you is, in like the simple, or I guess this could apply to the chain as well. If you have like a gaming mouse, is there any way to like program it?
Like,
do all of these have hotkeys basically? Like, or do I have to click on chain? Do I have to click chain, click single, click two? If I click on simple, do I have to click move and then buckle, lingual, mesial, distal, all that?
So the only programmable hotkeys that you can set to your like 3D mouse or your gaming mouse would really be available in the free-forming step and not so much in tooth placement. You can hover over here, and there isn't necessarily a quick way to move through the options. Like right now we're in simple and advanced in chain. There isn't a quick way to like cycle through all of that, but that really isn't going to save you a whole lot of time. It's really in the next step where you're actually like fine tuning everything is where you want your hotkeys to be set up. Okay. Yeah. But great question. Does anyone have anything else they want to adjust before we move on? We're going to be using the same principle of the chain mode with our full mouth restoration. So I want everyone to be pretty comfortable with this. You can see here that even before we even get to the free-forming steps, we're pretty much done with our design, right? We've already adjusted our occlusion. We've kind of fine-tuned our interproximal contacts. We've positioned the teeth where we want. And we can double check that the teeth are sitting on top of our restorations, like by hiding or just bringing back our preparations here and turning our full anatomic transparent. We can kind of see where it's going to be intersecting, right? So if I click next, this is actually going to give us, again, the crown bottom step. So at this point here, I'm actually going to hide my antagonist. One thing I actually really want to note is if you go, you can see here that it never really asked us for the insertion direction of our bridge, right? Which is very important when you're doing something like this that's sitting on top of multiple implants or even multiple preparations. I don't know why it's not given to us in the wizard step. That's something we've addressed to ExoCAD before, but you always want to double check your insertion direction, especially if it's sitting on multiple units and against your adjacent teeth, right? So I want everyone to go into their expert mode. And then from the expert mode, if you right click the background, the second option in your little hidden menu there is going to be insertion direction. Does everyone see that? Just a quick little head nod just so that everyone can double check that. This is something you do really want to check whenever you're working in a bridge. Because as you can see here, the insertion direction for my restoration is just like based on the individual tie bases themselves. And if you continue your design and finish it out, each of those positions will just be based on that one insertion direction, and you're never going to seat that restoration. You want to make sure that in insertion direction, you have the box that says unique insertion direction for bridges checked off. That way, it now accounts for both implant positions, and you can determine the insertion direction of your restoration based on both implants and not just them individually. This is one thing that gets missed a lot, especially for clients that are just starting out doing implant design. They go through multiple designs and they come out and they figure out like, hey, like these tie bases fit individually, but they're not seating on my implant positions because they've never adjusted their insertion direction. Yes, sir.
So let's just say that we have extremely divergent sets of implants in which that a unified insertion direction now shows up red onto your margin line, which if you're trying to remove the undercuts when you mill it, obviously it's going to mess up the margin. In 3 shape, you have the ability to remove undercuts where the interface fits right into the restoration, especially for like multi-units where they can be divergent, but it'll still seat.
Right.
In terms of that, how would you ignore that here? You would just do them individually, I guess, rather than unified?
Oh, yeah. So essentially, if you want to go about that way, then you can just uncheck unique insertion direction for bridges and just do them individually. And then those will seat. And if you feel that that is more efficient for you in terms of seating and post-processing, then by all means, we can definitely do that. But in this case here, you can see that these are fairly parallel, but any areas of undercut that it will create in your design will be highlighted in red on the screen. And you kind of want to just split the difference between the two.
Yeah, as long as they're not on the margin, it doesn't matter really.
Exactly. Yeah. No, great question. So we can see here that I actually want to have a unified insertion direction. And honestly, based on my path of draw as well, let's say I want to kind of adjust my view here. I'm creating a little bit more undercut on number 3, but that's fine. So right here looks pretty good. I'm going to click Set Current View as my insertion axis. And we're going to see here that if we rotate this around, you can see like any areas of major undercut that it'll just completely block out. And then we'll just click OK. And that's fine. A lot of times it'll just see and fill in anyways for you. Once we click OK through insertion direction, you're going to see your restorations merge to your implant site or your margin line, and that's completely fine. We're going to go back into the wizard mode. And now it's going to take us to abutment bottoms. Everyone with me so far? Everyone following along? From here in abutment bottoms, since we skipped the emergence profile step here, you can see that we don't really have a lot to do for abutment bottoms. The only thing we want to take note of is if we want to angulate our screw channel in this step, we can. So even with a manual positioning case here, you do have the option to angulate the screw channels. But in this case, none of my screw channels are coming through my incisal edges, so there's not really a need for me to angulate them. Since we don't have that abutment bottom, we can see here that the height profile border is again defaulted to 0.2. So the restoration will actually come out of this little collar. And if we want our design to come all the way down to that margin line that we selected, we're going to zero out that abutment bottom section there. And at that point, we're just going to go ahead and click Next. Okay, so in this step, we can see, so the biggest difference when you skip the emergence profiles and abutment bottoms, instead of having those two separate entities of design where you have like the uniform abutment bottom where you can click Control and Shift to uniformly add and create a convex or concave shape, the whole entire anatomy of your tooth library just merges directly to your implant site instead of separating it. And from here, you could actually just free-form your gingival interaction. What I like to do first and foremost before I do any sort of fine-tuning is obviously the Pontic tooth hasn't adapted to our gingiva yet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to Adapt, to my Adapt tab. We have the Pontic section. Then you have the option that says Adapt to Gingiva. We're going to go ahead and click that. I'm going to just adapt it right at 0 millimeters. And it's just going to cut any intersecting data, right? The interproximals, we can actually go ahead and just fine tune our occlusion and our interproximals here as well. So if we go to, say, occlusal, and I'm going to change it. I don't want like 0.1 millimeters of space. I just want 0. So I'm going to change that. And you're going to see I left this a little bit heavy on purpose. If I cut my intersections here, you're going to see now my occlusion is set to 0. But if I turn off show distances, you can see that I've created quite a large divot in my design, right? Because it just cut exactly where anything is intersecting, creating a perfectly 0 contact point. You can leave it like that, and then you can like smooth it out. What I typically like doing, instead of like creating such a large divot, I'm gonna undo, and I'm gonna go back to show distances. I can actually go into anatomic here. I can go into cusp tips. Again, to your point about like programming keys to different hotkeys, 1 and 2 takes you to add, remove, smooth, flatten. 3 takes you to cusp tips, 4 takes you to tooth parts, 5 is entire tooth, and 6 is ridge. So you can program all of those hotkeys. If you have a gaming mouse that has like multiple buttons by your thumb, you can quickly cycle through those instead of having to go to the menu every single time. For those of you that are new to Exocad, honestly, the only hotkeys I really recommend you committing to your memory is just hotkeys number 1 and 2 to take you between add, remove, smooth, flatten. That alone is going to exponentially increase your design time. So back to where I left off. So let's say I like where my cusp tips are in the position, but I just want to adjust this heavy area here. I'm going to go to anatomic. I'm going to lock my cusp tips. I'm going to go to my cusp tip selection. And then I'm just going to click and drag, and I'm just going to drag this back so that it's not as heavy. So when I adapt it to 0, it's not cutting so much anatomy away, right? It's making sure that I'm right at 0 everywhere, but I'm not creating such a large divot that I have to go back and I have to smooth back later on. I'm going to do that at every heavy point as well. You can see here, I'm not affecting much of my cusp tips because I've locked them in, right? I like where they are right now. Obviously, they're not perfect. That's not the focus of this design, but we'll go ahead. We can actually go into ridge here. This little ridge is high. I'm just going to click and drag and move that a little bit. Now that I've like fine-tuned my occlusion a little bit, I can go into adapt. I'll cut all my intersections or cut intersections at 0. And I can now ensure that all those points are at a 0 contact point without having to create too much of a divot all the way around, without losing too much of the tooth library's anatomy. I'm going to do the same thing with my interproximal contacts, right? So if I go into approximates, you can see here that I'm a little heavy. I left from my tooth position window. I'm a little heavy in my mesial contact here in my bridge. Again, instead of just cutting my intersections at 0 and creating this divot here, you can see that divot here. I can go back and I can smooth that out. But typically what I like to do, again, is I like to go to anatomic. I'm going to go to tooth parts. And I'm just going to slightly move that back towards the distal. I'm a little bit heavy still, and that's fine because I like how broad that contact point is. Now I'm going to go into adapt. Then I'm going to cut my intersections right at 0. And now I have a nice broad contact point at 0 without losing too much anatomy, without creating too big of a divot, right? Once I've adapted my occlusion, my gingiva, and my contact points, I can come in here to add, remove, and smooth flatten, and I can smooth out these areas just to make sure I have a nice smooth contact point there. One thing, hidden kind of tip is that if I want to smooth any surfaces, like say on the occlusal table, but I don't want to just blast through it and create like a completely round surface and lose all my anatomy, what I can do is if I hold Control while I'm in smooth flatten, it allows me to smooth the surface while maintaining the overall shape of the object that I'm smoothing. So that's what we call a shape preserving smooth, right? So if I undo that, right, let's say I like this cusp tip, but I want to smooth that surface. I don't want to just do a general smooth because I lose the overall shape there. If I hold Control and smooth, you can see that it maintains the shape of the overall tooth, but it just smooths that surface. For my Pontic, depending on the type of Pontic that you want to design for your patient, some people like to create like a bullet Pontic, etc. You're just going to use your free-forming tools to recontour that Pontic. If you hold Shift while you're in smooth flatten, you can actually go pretty quick and recontour that really quick. So here, I'm just going to do that. I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to smooth out this interaction just like this, just to make sure that the patient's going to be able to clean underneath there with ease, right? If I want to add any space, let's say I'm going to get rid of my jaw scan, we can see here that we still have a little bit of space in my gingival pocket. We can go into add remove, hotkey number 1. I'm going to increase my brush size because I don't want to just add to one point and create like a hump. I'm going to just quickly kind of come out and just add to this area. And then we can smooth it later on as well. So you can see here that because we didn't add our emergence profile, and this is where like you have to spend a little bit more time freeforming everything like subgingival, right? Because we didn't create that emergence profile. But if you find that this is more efficient for you, by all means, we can definitely do it. So our gingiva here, can add some points, add around. I'm not going to spend too much time. Normally for an actual case, you would spend some time and really contour this area where you're interacting with your gingiva. But I'm going to just quickly go through it for the sake of the design. Again, this concave shape here, I'm just going to go into add remove. I'm going to add a little bit of material. Hotkey number 2, and we're just going to smooth it down. You can see our design goes all the way around to our implant site. I'm going to go back to number 3. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to smooth all the way around. We can bring back our gingiva scan. We can see that we're pretty heavy still with our gingiva, so we're just going to bring that back. You can also hold shift a little to make the smoothing, the contouring a little bit quicker. But essentially, you would spend a little bit extra time there just recontouring and adding until you get the gingival interaction that you like. Anyone have any questions at this point? Yes, sir.
So you know how when you cut to occlusion, you're able to lock the anatomy of the occlusion, right? Of the occlusal table.
Mm-hmm.
When you're contouring subgingival like this, is there a way to like lock the minimum thickness so that you can contour and no matter what, you're not going to violate the minimum thickness?
So the design actually built into the software. In the beginning, you actually have like your minimum thickness, and you guys don't need to do this. I just want to show it on here. You have a minimum thickness set in the beginning. It really defaults depending on the material type that you choose. But say for this zirconia, it defaults to 0.4 millimeters is your minimum thickness, right? And you can adjust this ahead of time. I don't believe you can adjust it like in the middle of your design. But you're going to see if I hide my full anatomic here and I bring forward my minimal thickness, you can see that that little red area is your minimal thickness in any area that you're designing towards. If you touch that minimal thickness in the next step, it just automatically bumps it out.
Okay. All right, cool.
Yes, sir.
Would you be able to show us the points of contact?
I'm sorry?
Points of contact?
Points of contact for the occlusal?
Yeah.
So here,
Like an ideal.
like an ideal like occlusal setup. So it depends on like where you want your occlusion to be. And if we had more of the actual design, like more of the actual like scan, you can actually, what's nice is if you turn on include healthy, and in this case, this is a poor example because we don't have much of the entire scan, but you can actually see what the occlusion is like on the remaining dentition, and you can like mimic the occlusal design based on that as well. But typically, if you want more like a tripod occlusion here, what we're going to do is we would take our anatomy, our cusp tips. I'm going to turn off lock cusp tips here, and you can adjust the position based on that. So let's turn on. We can adjust it here. And if we wanted to add a little bit more, I'm going to go into my freeform. I'm going to add a little bit on this side. And again, I myself am not a CDT, so I haven't studied much in what ideal occlusion should be. But typically for cases like this, we would get like the full mouth scan, and I would just mimic the include healthy occlusion on this as well. We are going to be demonstrating later on the weekend, like mod jaw demonstrations. So like live motion jaw import and things like that. So definitely come around for that as well. Yes.
Can you do a dynamic? You
The
put it on
dynamic
trigger?
occlusion.
Yeah.
So we can. So the dynamic occlusion adaptation takes in the point, like if you uploaded your models to the virtual articulator and you ran the virtual articulator, right? For this specific case, you obviously need like a full arch scan for that. And I can definitely touch on that at the end of class, because the all on 4 case actually is just like one arch with a pre-op scan. So it doesn't have like an opposing that we're going to be working with, but I can definitely just touch in the virtual articulator and the dynamic adaptation from there. Yeah, no, for sure.
For impingement, I know you could do the cut view and you could do like a 2D cross section and you
Yes.
can measure your impingement.
Mhm.
Is there an option where it's like you can hold your mouse over it and it gives you a numerical value of like -0.3, or just
Oh, like impingement against your gingiva?
like
Right.
to see how far you're impinging into the tissue?
Right. So unfortunately, with this specific workflow, it doesn't give you like a numerical value like that. And if that's something that we really want to focus on, then we actually would probably want to do the workflow with the emergence profile, because when you have the abutment bottoms, you have that step where you can visualize how much space or how much impingement you have, and you can like create more of a convex concave shape. Unfortunately, when you're freeforming like this, it doesn't give you that numerical or like heat map. Yeah. But typically what I like to do though, is I like to turn off the jaw scan, and you can kind of see the interaction. So I would get it close, and then you can actually click the tools, and then you can go to your measurement tool and just click how far you are between your crown and your restoration. Measurement tool, and then you can click like nearest point, and then you would just click the crown position and then the position on gingiva, and it would tell you how far. Yep. So just for an example here, so that's a great question actually. So I'm going to hide a little bit of my gingiva. I'm going to go to tools, I'm going to go to measurement tool, and then I'm going to go distance, right? And I'm going to do start point. I'm going to hide my gingiva scan. I'm going to say right here. And then I'm going to bring back my gingiva scan and hide my full anatomic. And let's say we click on the gingiva. And you can see that that point there is like 0.6 millimeters, and we can actually click and drag that point along any point of the gingiva, and we can see how far we are. No problem. Again, it's not as efficient as like the abutment bottom step where you're uniformly seeing, but that is one way to check if you're doing this workflow. All right. No, great questions, everyone. So I'm going to close this out. Again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time like freeforming this case. As long as we get the general principles, we're going to keep moving along. So for connectors, for our full arch case here, the gingival piece of our design will actually be our connecting unit. But in this case here, since we're not doing a virtual gingiva, we actually do want to design our connectors, right? The quickest way that I like to do my connectors, again, is I like to use the thinner shapes, either the inverted or the right side up triangle here. And typically, I don't like going below, say 6 millimeters, especially again in the posterior. You can make thinner connectors when you work more towards the anteriors, but typically towards the back. I like to have a broad area connector just for strength purposes. But we can go back. Let's change this to 6 millimeters squared. And then anytime you make a change in minimum area as well as the actual shape, you have to click Apply Cross Section Shape Change. Right? So from there, I've applied my cross section shape change, and all you have to do is just click and drag your connectors into position. So I want to make sure that I'm not impinging on my gingiva with my connectors. So I'm going to move those up a little bit. And then after I just double check the buccal view, I'm going to adjust in my occlusal view and just make sure that the connectors are centered along my restoration. Do one more check along the lingual surface. That looks fine. And we can see here, none of our connectors are really interfering with our occlusion, but let's say if this is a little high for me, I can just bring that down slightly. And there is like an advanced connectors tool. Since this is typically an advanced level course, I'll show it to you. I don't usually show this to everyone when they're just starting out because it can get a little finicky. But we're going to go into the freeform connectors section here. And if you really want to take control of how your connectors interact with the adjacent teeth, you can see here that we can actually control the overall shape of the connector. So let's say I want to create a little bit more of a divot here. I'm going to use this control point in my connector sphere, and I'm just going to move this down slightly. And we can use the control arrows to ever so slightly adjust the shape of our connectors, just like that. What you want to be careful of is like you can adjust where the connectors are attached to these teeth, but you want to be careful that you do not accidentally cross like surfaces, right? You want to make sure that the deep blue side stays on the mesial tooth and the teal side of the connector stays on the distal tooth. I never really mess with any of the control spheres towards the center of the connector because they're really close together and you can get really jumbled up, and that's going to cause a lot of errors down the line. Honestly, when you stay in like the just clicking and dragging the shape, that's going to get the job done like 9 times out of 10. But in certain cases, let's say you're designing an anterior case and you really want to make sure that you have full control over your connectors, that's where you would make the shape change. You would go into freeform and you can control the overall shape of these connectors yourself. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right. So also one thing to note, if you've designed your restoration with like very broad contacts already and you already know that they're contacting in a large enough surface area, you can click this last option here, the little plus icon, and that's just going to join your restoration shape to shape directly without the use of any extra connector material. More often than not, I don't find myself designing my restorations with that broad of a contact area, so I rarely use it. But again, that's definitely up to preference. All right. Again, we're at screw hole design. I just want to reiterate the fact that it creates this like protective chimney around your screw hole. Let's say you wanted to design some like a chrome cobalt coping bridge that you want to stack completely all like enamel all the way around. Sometimes people like a chimney there so they can stack up to the chimney and it protects the screw channel. Other times you might have screw channels that go in between teeth, right? So if you have a screw channel that goes in between the teeth, not enough material is in that area to form a perfect screw channel, and sometimes you need that protective chimney there so that you can mill out that restoration. Does that make sense for everyone? In this case here, my screw channels are going through like a solid amount of material, so I don't need to add that extra layer of protection around them. And oftentimes, like that protective chimney like creates these, it gets in the way of your occlusion. So I actually just switch them off if I don't need them and just click next. And this is kind of like our final restoration, right? So we have a restoration that's going to sit directly on top of those tie bases with the screw channels punched right through them. Again, not the prettiest design, but don't judge me for it. It's not the highlight of this workshop. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
So after you bridge this together, do we have the option to freeform at this point? Like say if I was doing a temporary and I wanted this to be like thick on the lingual, do I have that? No.
Great question. So instead of like, if you wanted to do any like major changes, I suggest like going back into the wizard, right? Like you would deconstruct it, you would go back and change that specific point. Like if I wanted to change like a screw channel angulation at this point, you wouldn't be able to do that here. You would have to go back. You would lose your free-forming details when you go back to that step, but that's fine. If you want to just make last-minute changes to this specific design, all like this specific STL, instead of clicking I'm done, you can go to Freeform Restorations. You would select that option there and just click Next. What that's going to do is now that you have that final restoration, you come in and it gives you one last free-forming step. Like, so you can smooth, flatten, add, remove, etc.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
So yeah, so you can see here, like even with the connectors, you can now go in and you can actually use your free-forming tool to like adjust how smooth your connector interaction is as well. Also, with True Smile, and sometimes people get really tired of looking at those big yellow teeth when you're designing. So it's always nice to remember that you're looking at something like 100 times its actual size. So it's always nice to just turn on your True Smile, see what the actual tooth color is going to look like, zoom out a little bit, and just get a broader picture of it all, right? All right.